In the hushed, opulent world of five-star dining, the air inside the Ivory Coast tasted of money and a sharp, metallic top note of ambition. At this exclusive restaurant, one name was a thunderclap of fear: Eleanor Sinclair. She was the millionaire's wife, a woman whose cruelty was as legendary as her husband's fortune. She could end a career with a single cutting remark. For years, she reigned supreme, a flawless tyrant in a kingdom of crystal and silver. But tyrants always have a weakness. They build their empires on foundations of lies. And what happens when a new waitress, a quiet, observant woman with nothing to lose and a past she thought she had left behind, starts pulling at the threads? This is not a story about revenge. It is about the quiet dismantling of a monster, one perfectly served meal at a time. For Maeve Sterling, it was the taste of desperation. Just 3 months ago, she had been a forensic archivist, meticulously cross-referencing sources and chasing down obscure public records. Then the firm had closed, and her dream, along with her salary, evaporated. Now she was adjusting the stiff collar of a uniform that cost more than her last 3 pairs of shoes combined. Her first shift was a dizzying ballet of rules. Water glasses were to be filled to precisely 1 inch below the rim, never more, never less. Bread plates were cleared from the left and entrees served from the right. The one rule that was not written in the thick employee handbook was the most important one. It was delivered by Liam, the veteran bartender. "See that table," he murmured, nodding his head towards the corner booth, "the most coveted seat in the house. That is the throne, and the Queen arrives at 8 every Friday." Maeve followed his gaze. The booth was set slightly apart from the others, offering a commanding view of the entire dining room. "The Queen is Eleanor Sinclair," Liam said, his voice dropping an octave, "wife of Bennett Sinclair. You know, Sinclair Industries, the man who basically owns half the skyline." Maeve knew the name. Everyone in Chicago did. Bennett Sinclair was a titan, but his wife was a different kind of famous. She was a fixture in the society pages, always immaculate, her smile a perfect frozen sculpture. "She is our most important regular," Liam continued, "and our most feared. Don't make eye contact unless she addresses you. Don't speak unless spoken to." Maeve was assigned to the station adjacent to Table 9, a nerve-wracking proximity. She watched as the woman began her display. A young busboy, a kid just saving up for college, accidentally brushed her cashmere wrap with his tray. It did not even fall, just touched it. Eleanor recoiled as if he had tried to poison her. "Excuse me," she said. The 2 words cut through the murmurs. "Did you see what you just did?" she asked, her voice dangerously calm. "Your arm. It was over my plate. My food. The air is contaminated. I have lost my appetite." She pushed her plate an inch away. "Take it away. All of it." Mr. Lee, the manager, materialized, his face a mask of pained apology. He had to fire the boy on the spot, right in the middle of service. Eleanor watched him cry as he took off his apron, and she seemed to enjoy it. The story settled like a stone in Maeve's gut. This was a different breed of cruelty, personal, petty, and performed for an audience. It was an injustice, and Maeve knew it was wrong. What Eleanor did not know was that Maeve had spent her life finding the cracks in the armor of untouchable people. The lingering image of the busboy's humiliation stayed with Maeve as she retreated to the cramped, dimly lit break room that smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaning supplies. In this small sanctuary, the restaurant staff acted as a living archive of Eleanor's tyranny, a library of whispered anecdotes and bitter memories. Maeve leaned against a cold metal locker, listening as the veteran servers shared their scars. Remember when she claimed the sommelier was mocking her with a German Riesling? One waiter recounted with a weary sigh. She said it was a calculated insult to her New England heritage, which is a total joke because no one actually knows where her family is from. Another server added that Eleanor once forced a hostess to scrub off her lipstick in the middle of a shift because the shade was too provocative for a family establishment. These were not just stories of petty cruelty to Maeve, they were data points in a developing pattern. As a former archivist, Maeve recognized that Eleanor's obsession with theatrical perfection suggested a deep-seated insecurity rather than true strength. Liam, the bartender, slipped into the room to refill the coffee pot and caught Maeve's eye. "You are looking for the thread to pull, aren't you?" he murmured, his voice low enough to avoid being overheard by the management. "I have been here 10 years, and I can tell you that before she married Bennett Sinclair, there was no Eleanor Sinclair. She just appeared out of thin air with a polished accent and a vague backstory." Maeve felt her journalistic instincts tingle at the revelation. "A woman with no past is a woman with a secret," Maeve replied. Liam leaned in closer, his expression grim. "I have bartended at every high society haunt in this city for 20 years. I know the Bradfords and the Carringtons, but I have never heard of her supposed family, the Vances. It is like she was manufactured in a lab. That night, the stakes were raised when a cruel twist of fate struck the dining room. The senior waiter assigned to the Sinclair booth had called in sick with a sudden case of what the staff called Eleanoritis, leaving a vacuum that filled the manager with visible dread. Mr. Lee, his face ashen and slick with sweat, surveyed the remaining staff like a general choosing a soldier for a suicide mission before his eyes landed on Maeve. "Sterling," he said, his voice low and tense. "You are calm under pressure, and you don't rattle easily. You are on table 9 tonight. Do not make me regret this." A wave of sympathetic murmurs rippled through the staff as Maeve simply nodded and smoothed her apron. "I will handle it, Mr. Lee," she said, with a confidence that masked her racing heart. She spent the next 15 minutes preparing as if for battle, rereading the Sinclair file and memorizing every impossible detail. She knew that Eleanor favored still water at exactly 55 degrees and preferred her breadbasket to contain only brioche. Every detail was a potential landmine, but Maeve was not just serving food. She was beginning her investigation. She realized that this was the perfect opportunity to observe the dragon up close and find the fault lines in her carefully constructed facade. As the clock struck 8, the entrance doors swung open and the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted instantly. Eleanor walked in with a sharp, severe grace, her eyes scanning the room for a target. Maeve stood ready, the $100 bill from the previous week still tucked in her pocket like a reminder of the hidden truth she was destined to uncover. When the Sinclairs arrived at precisely 8 o'clock, the dining room shifted into a state of high alert. Maeve approached the corner booth with a posture of practiced neutrality, her expression a mask of professional calm that hid her sharp, investigative intent. The atmosphere around the table was electric, thick with the scent of lilies and the heavy weight of unearned power. Eleanor did not look up from her menu, her diamond rings catching the dim light as she adjusted her silk pashmina. Still water, 55 degrees, and a bottle of the 1996 Bordeaux. She clipped, her voice like a thin blade of ice that ignored Maeve's presence entirely. Maeve bowed slightly and replied, "Of course, Mrs. Sinclair. I shall return with the vintage immediately." Beside her, Bennett Sinclair sat like a ghost in his own life, his eyes weary and hollow as he stared at the white linen. He looked like a man trapped in a gilded cage, exhausted by the theatrical demands of his wife. Maeve executed the initial service with a dizzying ballet of rules, pouring the wine with such precision that not a single drop disturbed the tablecloth. As she placed the bread basket down, she noticed Eleanor pull her pashmina tighter over her left wrist, with a sudden, frantic motion. It was a small, defensive twitch that felt out of place for a woman who claimed to be a born aristocrat. "Is there something wrong with the temperature, Mrs. Sinclair?" Maeve asked, her tone perfectly even. Eleanor snapped her head up, her unlinking blue gaze flashing with a flicker of raw irritation. "The temperature of the room is adequate, waitress. Just ensure the service remains invisible." Maeve retreated into the shadows, her mind already cataloguing the strange tension. The battle lines were drawn. The real display of dominance arrived during the appetizer course when Maeve placed the delicate lobster tartare before the tycoon's wife. The atmosphere in the dining room was heavy with the expectation of a scene, as Eleanor Sinclair lived for the public execution of a server's pride. She stared at the plate for a long, suffocating moment, her eyes narrowing as if she had discovered a mortal insult in the garnish. Suddenly, she dropped her silver fork with a deliberate, ringing click that silenced the neighboring tables. "Excuse me, waitress," she said, her voice projecting with a theatrical sharpness that drew every eye in the room. "Look at this plate, your shadow. It was over my food for a full 3 seconds as you leaned in. It is utterly unhygienic." Maeve did not flinch, her heart beating with a steady, archival rhythm that refused to be disrupted by the high society performance. "I apologize if my presence was intrusive, Mrs. Sinclair," Maeve replied, her voice a perfect blend of professional concern and unshakable steel. "However, I can assure you the dish remains untainted and was prepared to the executive chef's exact standards." Eleanor's face tightened, her composure cracking ever so slightly at the lack of the expected groveling. "It is not about the chef," Eleanor hissed, her transatlantic accent slipping into a harder, flatter tone for a fraction of a second. "It is about the standard of invisibility you are failing to meet. I expect my meal to be served by a ghost, not a common girl who thinks her opinion carries weight." Maeve noticed the husband, Bennett, look down at his hands in shame, a silent witness to his wife's cruelty. "I understand completely," Maeve said, maintaining eye contact that was an act of quiet defiance. "I shall strive to be as invisible as the past you have worked so hard to curate." The words were a subtle, dangerous probe, and Maeve watched as Eleanor's grip tightened on the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. "What did you say?" Eleanor demanded, her voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper that lacked its usual polished cadence. "I said I shall ensure the rest of your service is flawless, Mrs. Sinclair," Maeve answered, her expression unreadable. Eleanor scoffed and pushed the plate away, declaring that the moment was ruined and her appetite was gone. Mr. Lee approached with a mask of pained apology, ready to intervene, but Maeve simply retrieved the plate with a silent, swift elegance that bordered on magic. As she walked toward the kitchen, Maeve felt the heat of Eleanor's gaze on her back, a predator realizing that the prey was not behaving as expected. The dragon had breathed fire, but the waitress was made of something that would not burn. Maeve now knew for certain that the cruelty was a shield, and she was determined to find exactly what it was protecting behind that wall of expensive silk and false names. After the shift concluded, and the opulent dining room was finally reduced to a silent forest of upturned chairs and white linen, Maeve stepped out into the biting Chicago night. The interaction with Eleanor had lit a fuse within her, and as she walked toward her small apartment, she felt the $100 bill Bennett Sinclair had pressed into her hand earlier that evening. It felt like a guilty secret against her palm, a bribe for her silence, or perhaps a silent apology for the monster he shared a life with. "It is not about the money, Bennett," she whispered to the empty street. "It is about the truth." Once inside the sanctuary of her cramped living space, Maeve did not head for bed, but instead moved to her old laptop, the keyboard worn smooth from thousands of hours of research. She fired up the machine, the blue light of the screen illuminating her determined features, as she returned to the mindset of a forensic archivist. She knew that people like Eleanor Sinclair built their empires on foundations of lies, but in the digital age, a lie always left a trail of crumbs if you knew where to look. Maeve began by pulling up every high society article featuring Eleanor from the last 10 years, noting the consistent but empty narrative of a quiet New England upbringing. "The Vances of Massachusetts do not exist in any census I can find," Maeve muttered to herself as her fingers flew across the keys. She realized that Eleanor had not been born into this world, she had been manufactured. The story of the mysterious socialite was too polished, a perfect frozen sculpture that lacked the messy reality of a genuine past. Maeve started digging into the guest lists of the charity galas and society events Bennett had attended in the 12 months leading up to their whirlwind engagement. She was looking for the moment the ghost took form. "Where were you the year before you became a queen?" she asked the glowing screen. She began a cross-referenced search of regional social registries, moving away from the East Coast and toward the southern states, guided by a hunch about that fleeting, flat accent she had heard during the Tartar confrontation. The atmosphere in the room was thick with the thrill of the hunt as Maeve bypassed surface-level records and began accessing deep web archives of regional newspapers. She was looking for a face that matched the bone structure of the millionaire's wife, but lacked the expensive refinements of a Chicago stylist. "Everyone comes from somewhere, Eleanor, and I am going to find your somewhere," she vowed, as she opened a reverse image search tool and uploaded a cropped high-resolution photo of the woman's unyielding blue eyes. As the progress bar crawled across the screen, Maeve felt the weight of the mystery pressing in on her, knowing that the answer was buried under layers of Sinclair wealth. The loop was opening, and the truth was beginning to claw its way toward the surface. The digital investigation deepened as the clock struck 2 in the morning, the silence of Maeve's apartment punctuated only by the rhythmic tapping of keys. Her forensic training had taught her that the more polished a present appeared, the more desperate the attempt to scrub the past, and Eleanor Sinclair's history was too pristine to be real. Maeve bypassed the official society profiles and began a deep search, using a cropped, high-resolution scan of Eleanor's face, focusing on the distinct, sharp jawline and the set of the eyes before any suspected cosmetic refinements. For hours, the search results returned only recent gala photos and magazine covers, a sea of midnight blue dresses and diamond necklaces that offered no clues. "You are hiding in plain sight, aren't you?" Maeve whispered to the glowing monitor, her eyes burning with exhaustion but her mind sharp with intent. She decided to change her parameters, searching for any digital footprint of a woman with those specific features in much older regional archives from across the country. Suddenly, on the 12th page of a deep web search result, a grainy link appeared that led to a defunct talent agency website based in Mississippi. The page was a poorly designed relic from the early 2000s, barely functional and thick with broken image icons. But on the client headshot page, amidst a sea of aspiring actors with hopeful smiles, was a picture that made Maeve's breath catch in her throat. The girl in the photo was younger, perhaps in her early 20s, with a brassy, over-bleached blonde hair and heavy blue eyeshadow that screamed of a different life. She wore cheap, shiny lip gloss and a desperate, determined expression, but the underlying bone structure was undeniably that of the millionaire's wife. "I found you." Maeve breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized the sophisticated Eleanor Sinclair was a fabrication. Beneath the grainy photo was a name that had never appeared in any Chicago society column, a name that carried no weight of old money prestige. It was not Eleanor Vance, but Jolene Whitlock from Biloxi. Maeve leaned back in her chair, a slow smile spreading across her face as the revelation settled into the room. This was the crack in the armor, the hidden origin that the dragon had spent millions of her husband's dollars to erase from history. The New England pedigree was a theatrical prop, and the transatlantic accent was a learned script designed to mask a harder, southern reality. So, Jolene, what exactly happened in Biloxi to make you so afraid of the light? Maeve wondered aloud, her investigative fire fully ignited. The discovery changed the dynamic of the entire game, turning the untouchable socialite into a woman with a dangerous secret. Maeve knew that information like this was a weapon, and like any forensic archivist, she knew that the truth was only the beginning of the dismantling. The loop was tightening, and the dragon was no longer a mystery. The discovery of the name Jolene Whitlock acted as a digital Rosetta Stone, allowing Maeve to translate the carefully constructed lies of Eleanor Sinclair back into a raw and gritty reality. Adrenaline surged through her veins, chasing away the fatigue of the late hour as she began a new, targeted search for Jolene Whitlock and Biloxi, Mississippi. The results did not just trickle in, they poured across her screen like a flood of forgotten sins. Maeve found a series of local news articles from 2006 that detailed a scandal involving a fraudulent regional beauty pageant. The headlines were sensational, describing a young woman who had been a runner-up but was accused of stealing the winner's prize fund and disappearing before the local authorities could question her. "So you were a thief before you were a queen, Jolene," Maeve whispered, her eyes scanning the digital text with the precision of a hawk. She found a grainy scan of a police report mentioned that listed Jolene's height, eye color, and a distinctive small scar on her left wrist, which perfectly explained why Eleanor was always so frantic to keep that area covered with her expensive silk pashminas. The pieces were fitting together with a terrifying logic, revealing that the millionaire's wife was not just a social climber, but a fugitive from a past she had literally paid to bury. Maeve then stumbled upon a link to a fan forum for a forgotten reality show pilot called Bayou Queens that had featured Jolene as a main cast member. The forum was a graveyard of old comments and broken links, but the descriptions of Jolene were vivid, painting a picture of a woman who was fiercely ambitious and openly despised her humble roots. One user had written that Jolene would do anything to get out of Biloxi, even if it meant burning every bridge behind her. Maeve realized that the cruelty Eleanor displayed at the Ivory Coast was not a product of her current wealth, but a long-standing defense mechanism designed to keep the world at a distance. "You aren't protecting your status, you are protecting your secret," Maeve realized, leaning back in her chair as the true anatomy of the bully was laid bare. This was the motive behind the theatrical perfection and the impossible standards. Any deviation from the script was a threat to her very existence. Maeve knew that for a woman like Eleanor, being exposed as a common fraud from a trailer park was a fate far worse than prison. The forensic archivist had found the wire that could pull the entire facade down, and she felt a sense of quiet triumph. The dragon was no longer an invincible titan of Chicago society. She was a woman living in a glass house built on a foundation of stolen money and fabricated names. Maeve closed her laptop, the silence of the room now feeling heavy with the power of the truth she held in her mind. She was ready to return to the restaurant, not as a submissive waitress, but as a silent witness to a lie that was about to unravel. Armed with the digital proof of Jolene Whitlock's past, Maeve returned to the sterile, white linen battlefield of the Ivory Coast with a new and dangerous clarity. She understood now that every theatrical outburst and every cutting remark from Eleanor Sinclair was a calculated maneuver to maintain a distance between her curated present and her gritty origins. During a slow period before the dinner rush, Maeve found Liam at the bar and leaned against the polished mahogany, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that barely reached his ears. "Liam, I found the bridge she burned to get here," Maeve said, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of management. "Her name isn't Vance, and she didn't grow up in a New England manor. She is Jolene Whitlock from a coastal town in Mississippi called Biloxi." Liam stopped polishing a crystal highball glass, his seasoned face tightening with a mixture of shock and grim satisfaction. "Biloxi," he repeated, testing the sound of the word as if it were a foreign currency. "That is a long way from the society pages of Chicago. How did she make the jump?" Maeve looked at the empty corner booth that Eleanor claimed as her throne and felt a chill of investigative triumph. She didn't jump, Liam. She stole her way out. There was a beauty pageant scandal and a missing prize fund 16 years ago. She vanished and reinvented herself using Sinclair's wealth as a shield against the authorities. Liam placed the glass on the rack with a soft ring and looked at Maeve with a newfound reverence. If that is true, she isn't just a bully, she is a fugitive hiding in plain sight. But be careful, Maeve. A cornered animal is the most dangerous kind, and she has everything to lose. Maeve nodded, her expression as unyielding as the stone floors of the restaurant. "I am not looking for a fight, Liam. I am looking for the truth to be the final word." As the first guests began to arrive, and the scent of expensive truffle oil filled the air, the atmosphere in the restaurant felt different to Maeve, as if the walls themselves were waiting for the facade to crumble. She realized that the dragon was not protecting her status, she was protecting her life, and every server she had ever humiliated was a ghost of the girl she used to be. The loop was no longer just a curiosity. It was a weapon of quiet justice that Maeve held in her mind like a loaded gun. "The next time she tries to breathe fire, she will realize I know exactly where the scales are missing," Maeve vowed to herself as she adjusted her stiff collar and prepared for the arrival of the millionaire's wife. The truth was the ultimate surgical strike, and the forensic archivist was ready to deploy it. The hunt for the ultimate proof of Jolene Whitlock's deception led Maeve back to the digital shadows of the Bayou Queens fan forum, where she located a former production assistant named Sarah Jenkins. Through a series of encrypted emails and a tense late-night phone call, Sarah painted a vivid picture of the woman who would become Eleanor Sinclair, describing a girl who was fiercely ambitious and possessed a burning shame about her mechanic father and checkout clerk mother. "She thought she was better than all of us," Sarah explained, her voice tinged with a mix of old resentment and pity. She practiced her accent in the mirror for hours, trying to sound like those old movie stars while she scrubbed the grease from her fingernails. The most devastating revelation came when Sarah mentioned the show's unaired finale, which had been suppressed by legal threats for over a decade. According to Sarah, the producers had staged a monster truck princess pageant as a big finish, a humiliating spectacle that forced the girls to ride on the back of a pickup truck wearing cheap plastic tiaras and polyester sashes. Jenny had a complete meltdown on camera. Sarah revealed, using Jolene's old stage name, it was not one of her calculated fights for the ratings. It was a real, raw explosion of hatred for her life and that town. She was screaming and crying, telling everyone they were trash, before she threw her tiara at the director. Maeve gripped her phone, sensing that this suppressed footage was the digital Rosetta Stone she needed to ensure Eleanor could never strike again. Sarah mentioned that while the production company had been dissolved, the raw tapes were likely still sitting in a temperature-controlled storage vault in Atlanta. For Eleanor, that tape would be the end of the world because it is the ultimate proof that her entire existence is a fraud, Sarah added with a dry laugh. Maeve realized that the millionaire's wife was not just hiding a humble past, she was hiding a moment of utter, unrefined loss of control that would shatter her image of cold perfection. "I don't need the physical tape to win," Maeve thought as she scribbled notes on a legal pad. "I just need the specific details of that night to show her that her shield of wealth is transparent to me. This information was the final stone Maeve needed to collect before the inevitable confrontation. She thanked Sarah profusely and promised to keep her identity confidential, feeling a shiver of excitement as the pieces of the puzzle locked into place. The dragon was no longer a mystery of high society. She was a scared girl from a truck rally who had traded her soul for a seat at a white linen table. Maeve knew that Eleanor would be back at the restaurant soon to re-establish her dominance, but this time the waitress would be waiting with the ghost of a cheap plastic tiara in her pocket. The loop was ready to be closed, and the truth was a surgical strike waiting to happen. Back at the restaurant, the atmosphere was more tense than ever as Eleanor Sinclair returned for another Friday dinner, this time looking for blood. She was dressed in a severe black silk suit that absorbed the dim light of the dining room, appearing as if she were ready for war rather than a meal. Her presence acted as a silent alarm, causing the junior staff to scatter while the veterans tightened their posture in a collective defensive crouch. Eleanor's eyes immediately locked onto Maeve with a predatory focus, and she began a series of petty, impossible demands designed to break the waitress's composure in front of the surrounding elite guests. She complained that the ambient temperature was 3 degrees too high, and that the scent of the floral arrangement at the next table was an assault on her senses. Maeve continued to serve with a placid, unyielding surface that drove Eleanor to a state of near hysteria, as the lack of fear in Maeve's eyes was an irritant the millionaire's wife could not tolerate. Mr. Lee watched from the shadows, his hands wringing a linen cloth as he prayed for the service to end without a casualty. "Waitress, come here immediately," Eleanor commanded, her voice ringing out like a gavel in the quiet room. Maeve approached the table and stood with her back perfectly straight. "Yes, Mrs. Sinclair, how may I assist you?" Eleanor leaned forward, her face a mask of cold fury. "You think your silence is a sign of intelligence, but to me, it is just insolence. I want you to explain why my husband's scotch was poured with 3 ice cubes instead of the 2 he specifically requested." Maeve looked at the glass, knowing she had followed the instructions to the letter. "I followed the order exactly as stated, Mrs. Sinclair, but I will be happy to rectify the situation if it displeases you." Eleanor scoffed and looked at her husband, Bennett, who remained silently staring at the tablecloth. "You see, Bennett, this is the decline of standards I am always talking about. This girl thinks she knows better than the guest." Maeve noticed the small scar on Eleanor's left wrist peeking out from beneath her sleeve as she gestured wildly. "Standards are indeed a curious thing, Mrs. Sinclair," Maeve replied, her voice dropping to a level that only Eleanor could hear. "Some people spend their whole lives building them just to hide where they actually began. It must be exhausting to be so perfect when the past is so messy." Eleanor froze, her breath catching in her throat as she stared at Maeve with a flicker of genuine alarm. "What did you just say to me?" she hissed, her transatlantic accent trembling. "I said I will get that fresh drink for your husband right away," Maeve answered, her expression as unreadable as a closed archive. The dragon was now fully alert, sensing that the waitress was no longer just a servant, but a witness to something she thought was dead and buried. The loop was tightening, and the inevitable explosion was only a heartbeat away. The ultimate escalation ignited just as the main course plates were being cleared, when the atmosphere in the dining room turned from mere tension to a suffocating sense of impending doom. Eleanor Sinclair suddenly let out a small, theatrical gasp that acted like a signal flare, drawing every eye toward the corner booth where she sat in her severe black silk. She brought a trembling, manicured hand to her left earlobe, her fingers fluttering frantically against her skin in a carefully crafted display of panic. "Oh my goodness, it is gone," she cried out, her voice rising to a shrill pitch that sliced through the hushed murmurs of the elite clientele. Bennet Sinclair turned toward her with a weary furrow in his brow, but Eleanor was already standing up, her chair screeching back against the stone floor. "My pearl earring, Bennet, the rare South Sea pearl you bought for our anniversary. It is missing." She did not wait for a response before her sharp, unforgiving gaze locked onto Maeve, who was standing just 2 feet away with a tray of used silver. "You, the waitress, you were the last one here, leaning over me to clear the salad plates." The accusation was as clear as it was devastating, a public branding designed to ruin Maeve's life in a single stroke. Maeve felt a cold dread wash over her, but her forensic training kicked in, keeping her posture perfectly straight and her expression unyielding. "Mrs. Sinclair, I assure you I did not see an earring fall, nor did I touch your jewelry." Eleanor let out a short, ugly laugh that sounded more like a bark. "Of course you would say that, but it vanished the moment you reached across me. I want her searched immediately, Mr. Lee, and I want the kitchen turned upside down." The manager materialized at the table, his face ashen and slick with sweat as he looked at Maeve with a mixture of awe and terror. "Mrs. Sinclair, please, perhaps it just fell into the folds of your suit." Mr. Lee stammered, his voice shaking with the fear of losing such a powerful patron. "I have checked, you fool. It is not here." Eleanor hissed, her face flushed with a deep, mottled red as she enjoyed the public execution of Maeve's reputation. "Call the police and have this girl detained for theft. She has stashed it somewhere, or perhaps she has it in her pocket right now." This was the ultimate power play, a public destruction based on a lie that Eleanor knew would be impossible to disprove in the eyes of Chicago high society. The other diners watched with undisguised contempt, their eyes already judging Maeve as a thief. Maeve stood still at the center of the storm, realizing that the dragon was not just breathing fire, she was trying to incinerate the only person who knew the truth about Biloxi. The trap was brilliant, but Eleanor did not realize that Maeve was not fighting with denials. She was preparing to change the narrative entirely with a single, surgical strike of hidden knowledge. "If you want to search, Mrs. Sinclair, we should start exactly where the secrets are kept," Maeve thought, her heart beating with a steady, determined rhythm as she prepared her counterattack. As the search for the missing pearl earring intensified and a suffocating sense of doom settled over the dining room, Maeve Sterling realized that silence was no longer a shield, but a trap. Mr. Lee was wringing his hands in a frantic display of anxiety, while the elite guests at neighboring tables began to whisper their undisguised contempt for the accused waitress. Eleanor Sinclair stood like a vengeful goddess in her black silk, her eyes flashing with a triumphant light as she prepared to witness Maeve's total professional destruction. "I have nothing to hide, Mr. Lee, and I am happy to empty my pockets for everyone to see," Maeve said, her voice cutting through the noise with a clarity that demanded attention. She calmly placed her notepad, a pen, and a simple tube of lip balm on a nearby service stand, but Eleanor only scoffed at the display of transparency. "As if you would be so clumsy as to keep a $250,000 gem in your apron. You probably stashed it in the kitchen garbage to retrieve later." Eleanor hissed, her face contorted with a cruel smirk that she thought was her final victory. Maeve took a deep breath, knowing this was the precise moment to deploy her hidden knowledge and pivot from the defense to a surgical strike against the accuser's credibility. She looked directly into Eleanor's eyes, ignoring the crowd, and spoke with a level of calm that felt like the eye of a hurricane. "Mrs. Sinclair, high-pressure situations can be incredibly disorienting for anyone, and they can often make a person feel like they are back in a different time or a different place entirely." Maeve paused for a beat, letting the air in the room grow heavy with a sudden, unexplained tension, like, for instance, Biloxi. The name dropped into the charged atmosphere of the Ivory Coast with the force of a physical blow, and Maeve watched as the mask of the elegant millionaire's wife finally shattered. Eleanor froze, her breath catching in her throat as the blood drained from her face, leaving her with a deathly ashen pallor that no amount of expensive makeup could hide. What did you just say?" she stammered, her imperious transatlantic accent vanishing instantly to reveal the harder, flatter vowels of a woman who had spent her youth in a coastal town in Mississippi. The other diners looked on in confusion, but to Eleanor, the word was a signal that her entire carefully curated existence was under siege. "I merely suggested that stress can be confusing," Maeve repeated softly, her expression unreadable. "Perhaps you should check the table once more, because secrets have a way of surfacing when we least expect them." The power dynamic in the room shifted in an instant as the predator realized her prey had found the one wire that could pull the entire building down. Eleanor was no longer the accuser. She was a woman drowning in a lie she thought was buried 10 feet deep. Maeve stood her ground, the silent witness to a truth that was about to turn the elite dining room into a theater of the absurd. The name Biloxi hung in the air like a terminal diagnosis, and the silence that followed was so profound it felt as though the very oxygen had been sucked out of the Ivory Coast. Eleanor Sinclair stood paralyzed, her hands trembling as the cold weight of the past she had spent millions to bury suddenly crashed into the present. The arrogant socialite who had been demanding a police arrest only moments ago was gone, replaced by a woman whose raw, primal fear was visible to anyone who knew where to look. "How do you know that name?" Eleanor whispered, her voice cracking and losing every ounce of its practiced transatlantic polish. Maeve did not answer the question directly, instead choosing to maintain a level of professional calm that highlighted the villain's total loss of composure. "I merely suggested that memories can be tricky, Mrs. Sinclair," Maeve said, her voice steady and clear for the surrounding guests to hear. "Sometimes we think we have lost something valuable when it has simply been hidden in plain sight, much like a person's history." The shift in the room was palpable as the diners at neighboring tables began to exchange puzzled glances, sensing that the waitress had just delivered a message that was far more damaging than a theft accusation. Bennett Sinclair looked at his wife with a mixture of confusion and sudden suspicion, his own posture straightening as he sensed the seismic shift in the narrative. "Eleanor, what is going on?" he asked, his voice weary but firm. Eleanor could not meet his eyes, her gaze fixed on Maeve with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. She realized in that moment that Maeve was not just a waitress, but a researcher who had dismantled her armor from the inside out. The surgical strike had hit its mark with devastating precision, turning the public execution of Maeve's career into a public exposure of Eleanor's fraud. "I think we should all take a deep breath," Maeve continued, her expression as unyielding as a marble statue. "Before the authorities are involved, perhaps we should look for the missing piece one last time, because once the light is turned on, there is no going back to the shadows." The threat was as clear as a bell, a final warning that if Eleanor continued her pursuit of Maeve's destruction, Maeve would finish the job of exposing Jolene Whitlock to the world. The power in the room had completely inverted, and the dragon was now cornered in her own lair. Eleanor swallowed hard, her throat working as she struggled to find a script that no longer existed. She was no longer the queen of Chicago society. She was a girl from a Mississippi trailer park who had been caught in a lie that was 16 years old. Maeve stood ready for the next move, her heart beating with the rhythm of justice finally being served in the quietest way possible. The truth was out, and the facade was crumbling into dust. To provide an escape route that would simultaneously save her career and cement Eleanor's humiliation, Maeve decided to play her final psychological card. She knew the earring was likely tucked away in a silk clutch or planted nearby, but she chose a more surgical method to end the theater. "Mr. Sinclair," Maeve said, turning her attention away from the trembling Eleanor to her bewildered husband. Before the police are summoned, and this becomes a permanent matter of public record, perhaps you could check the cuff of your own tuxedo jacket, specifically the one on the right. Bennett Sinclair looked at her with a mixture of confusion and exhaustion. My cuff, why would it be there? Maeve maintained her professional composure, her voice projecting just enough for the surrounding tables to hear every syllable. Small, heavy objects have a curious way of snagging on fine fabric during a meal, especially when someone is sitting as close as your wife is tonight. Eleanor shot Maeve a look of pure venom, but she remained silent, realizing that Maeve was offering her a way out that would make her look like a fool rather than a criminal. It was a checkmate. If the jewel was found on her husband, the entire accusation of theft would collapse into a ridiculous farce. Hesitantly, Bennett plunged his hand into the fold of his jacket, his expression shifting from skepticism to genuine surprise as his fingers closed around a small, hard object. He pulled it out, and there, glittering like a cold star under the expensive lighting of the Ivory Coast, was the missing pearl earring. A collective gasp went through the dining room as the tension broke into a wave of hushed ridicule. "Well, I will be damned," Bennett muttered, his face coloring with a deep shade of embarrassment. "It must have caught on my sleeve when I helped you with your chair, Eleanor. All of this fuss, and it was right here the whole time. The humiliation was instantaneous and complete." Eleanor Sinclair, the woman who had demanded a public execution and a police investigation, now looked like a hysterical, paranoid socialite who had lost her senses over a misplaced trinket. Her friends at the neighboring tables suddenly found the patterns on their fine china intensely fascinating, distancing themselves from the scene. Without another word, Eleanor snatched the earring from her husband's hand and grabbed her pashmina, her face a mottled red of defeat. She stormed out of the restaurant, her head held high but her entire posture screaming that she had lost the battle. Bennett was left to settle the bill, leaving an obscene amount of cash on the table as a silent apology before following her out. Mr. Lee looked at Maeve with a mixture of awe and terror, realizing she had faced the dragon and won. Maeve took a steadying breath, knowing she had not just found an earring, but she had dismantled a tyrant by simply pointing toward the truth. The reign of terror was over, and the dragon had been driven from her throne. 3 weeks passed, with Eleanor Sinclair conspicuously absent from her corner throne, and the atmosphere inside the Ivory Coast shifted into a season of palpable relief that felt like a long winter finally breaking. The staff no longer walked on eggshells, and even the clinking of silver against porcelain seemed to carry a lighter, more melodic tone without the threat of a socialite's rage hanging over the room. Maeve Sterling had become a figure of quiet reverence among her peers, the woman who had made the Queen look like a court jester with a single word. However, Maeve knew the dragon had not been killed, only wounded, and her forensic instincts warned her that a woman like Jolene Whitlock would never forgive such a public humiliation. She spent her nights off finishing her digital dossier, eventually securing a grainy, digitized copy of the Bayou Queen's raw footage from a contact Sarah Jenkins had provided. The video was the ultimate evidence, a physical manifestation of the lie that was Eleanor Sinclair. Maeve watched the screen in her quiet apartment as a younger, unrefined version of the millionaire's wife had a screaming meltdown on a pickup truck, her cheap plastic tiara crooked as she shouted at the cameras. "You are more afraid of this girl than you are of the law," Maeve whispered to the glowing monitor, realizing that the fear of being seen as common was Eleanor's true prison. The curiosity loop regarding how to end this reign of terror was tightening, and Maeve knew that the final confrontation was inevitable. She prepared herself for the moment the dragon would return to the scene of her defeat to attempt a reassertion of dominance. Whispers followed Maeve through the restaurant, with Liam the bartender often pausing to check on her. "She is quiet, Maeve, which means she is plotting," Liam warned as he polished the mahogany. "A woman who has spent 16 years building a glass house will not let one waitress throw a stone without a fight." Maeve simply nodded, her expression as unyielding as the records she used to archive. "Let her come," Maeve replied, her voice steady and sure. "She is fighting to protect a shadow, but I am standing in the light of the truth." This part of the narrative arc focused on the mounting tension, the quiet before the final storm, where the underdog prepares her final surgical strike. The staff treated Maeve like a hero, but she felt more like a sentry, waiting for the inevitable arrival of the severe black silk and the unblinking blue eyes. Maeve held the digital key to the storage vault of Jolene Whitlock's secrets, and she was ready to turn it. The story was moving toward its final act, where the truth would not just be spoken, but used to dismantle a tyrant forever. Every shift at the restaurant felt like a countdown, and the forensic archivist was ready for the clock to strike 8 one last time. The inevitable return of Eleanor Sinclair occurred on a sweltering Friday night, when the air in the restaurant was thick with the scent of roasted garlic and the nervous energy of the weekend rush. She did not arrive with her husband this time, but entered alone, walking with a sharp, severe grace that signaled she was on a mission of total destruction. She bypassed the hostess station and marched directly to her usual table, her eyes scanning the room until they found Maeve, who was busy refilling water glasses at the station nearby. Eleanor crooked a single imperious finger, a silent summons that felt like a death sentence to the watching staff. Mr. Lee stepped forward to intervene, but Maeve gave him a subtle, determined shake of her head and smoothed her apron before approaching the dragon's lair. "Sit down," Eleanor commanded, her voice a low and menacing hiss that vibrated with suppressed rage. Maeve remained standing, her back perfectly straight. "I am currently on duty, Mrs. Sinclair, and restaurant policy forbids servers from sitting with guests." Eleanor leaned forward, her unblinking blue eyes burning with a cold, predatory fire. "Sit down immediately, or I will buy this entire establishment by morning and turn it into a parking garage just to watch you lose your livelihood. Your choice." Maeve pulled out the chair and sat, her posture as unyielding as a stone pillar, while the other diners watched in terrified silence. "I have had my husband's legal team run a complete background check on you, Maeve Sterling," Eleanor began, her voice dripping with a cruel, satisfied smirk. "I know about your failed journalism career and your pathetic student loans. I know about the tiny apartment you can barely afford. You are a nobody, a vindictive little roach who thinks she can play games with people like me." She leaned back, crossing her arms over her severe black suit. "By the time I am finished with you, you won't even be able to get a job washing dishes in a dive bar. I will call every employer in this city and tell them you are a thief and a blackmailer. I will bury you in legal fees until you are begging for mercy. Do you understand me?" Maeve listened to the litany of threats without a single flinch, her forensic mind already categorizing the outburst as a final, desperate attempt to incinerate the truth. "You are right that I am a researcher, Eleanor," Maeve replied, her voice soft but carrying an unmistakable edge of steel. "And because I am good at my job, I know that your threats are just a shield for your own terror. You aren't worried about my career. You are worried about the fact that I know you are actually Jolene Whitlock from Biloxi." The name hit the table like a physical blow, causing Eleanor to freeze as the blood drained from her face once again. The power shift was instantaneous, and the dragon realized that the waitress was not just an underdog, but the keeper of her deepest secret. The final act had begun. At the mention of her true name, the facade of Eleanor Sinclair finally underwent a total and irreversible collapse, leaving behind only the ghost of Jolene Whitlock. Maeve leaned forward, her voice a calm but unrelenting force that filled the small space between them at the corner booth. I know about the monster truck rallies and the pageant in Biloxi where the prize money went missing, Maeve said, her eyes fixed on the woman who was now trembling with a deathly pallor. But more importantly, I know about the unaired finale of the Bayou Queens reality show. I know about the mud, the screaming, and the cheap plastic tiara you threw at the director because you hated your life so much. Eleanor tried to speak, but her throat worked in a silent, desperate struggle for air, her transatlantic accent completely abandoned for the terrified silence of a cornered animal. I have found the footage, Jolene, the tape that your husband's lawyers spent 16 years trying to keep in the dark, Maeve continued, the use of the old name acting as a deliberate and final twist of the knife. Here is what is going to happen now. You are going to stand up and walk out of this restaurant, and you are never going to return. You will not threaten me, you will not harass the staff, and you will not speak my name to any of your legal teams ever again. Eleanor stared at her, her eyes wide with a soul-deep horror as she realized that her shield of wealth was now entirely transparent to the woman sitting opposite her. If I hear so much as a whisper of you causing trouble for anyone at the Ivory Coast, I will dedicate my life to making that footage the most watched video in Chicago high society. Maeve promised, her expression as unyielding as the forensic records she had spent her life protecting. I will send it to every gossip blog, every society columnist, and every one of your fair-weather friends who currently think you were born in a New England manor. I wonder how Bennett will feel when he sees his elegant wife shrieking like a common thief in a trailer park. Every word was a perfectly placed surgical strike that dismantled the tyrant's ego piece by piece until there was nothing left but raw, unadulterated defeat. Eleanor looked not like a millionaire's wife, but like the scared girl from the truck rally who had traded her soul for a seat at a table she never truly belonged to. The choice is yours, Maeve added, her tone final and absolute. You can continue this war and lose everything, or you can vanish back into your gilded cage and leave the rest of us in peace. For a long, silent moment, the only sound was the clinking of expensive silver in the distance, a reminder of the world Eleanor was about to lose if she made the wrong move. She realized in that moment that Maeve was not a waitress to be bullied, but the keeper of the truth, and the truth was the only currency that Eleanor could not buy. The dragon was defeated, and the reign of terror was over. Slowly, shakily, the woman once known as Eleanor Sinclair rose from the table, but the person who stood up was clearly Jolene Whitlock, stripped of every layer of her expensive, fraudulent prestige. She did not say a single word in her defense, because there were no words left that could bridge the gap between her curated lies and the raw truth Maeve had laid bare on the white linen. The unblinking blue eyes that had once terrorized the staff were now clouded with a soul-deep defeat, scanning the room one last time not for a victim, but for an exit. With the last shred of her dignity, she turned and walked toward the entrance of the Ivory Coast, her steps heavy and lacking their usual imperious grace. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut behind her with a final resonant thud, and it was as if a curse had been lifted from the very foundation of the building. A stunned, heavy silence filled the dining room for several heartbeats as the elite guests and the frozen staff tried to comprehend the bizarre scene they had just witnessed. Then, a quiet, spontaneous burst of applause erupted from the kitchen doorway, where the line cooks and the busboys had been watching the dismantling of their tyrant. Mr. Lee walked over to the corner booth, his face a mixture of total disbelief and profound awe as he looked at the empty seat that had been the throne of a monster for so many years. "I do not know what you said to her, Sterling, but I have never seen that woman look so small," he whispered, his voice trembling with the relief of a man who had finally escaped a nightmare. Maeve took a long, steadying breath, the adrenaline finally beginning to recede as she stood up and straightened her apron with the same practiced neutrality she had maintained throughout the war. "I did not say anything that was not already written in her own history, Mr. Lee," Maeve replied, her voice steady and clear. "The truth is simply a weight she could no longer carry in a place like this." She reached for a water pitcher at the service station, her movements fluid and calm as she returned to the rhythm of the floor. "Table 4 needs a refill, and I believe the guests at Table 7 are ready for their check," she added with a small, genuine smile that graced her lips for the first time in months. The staff watched her with a new kind of reverence, realizing that Maeve was no longer just a server, but the woman who had faced the dragon and sent it running from its own lair without firing a single shot of anger. The reign of terror was officially over, and the atmosphere in the restaurant began to fill with the sound of genuine laughter and easy conversation, no longer suppressed by the shadow of Eleanor Sinclair. Maeve felt a sense of quiet triumph, not because of the victory, but because the archives were finally closed on a long-standing injustice. She had used her skills to protect her peers, and in doing so, she had found her own way back to the light. The story of what happened at the corner booth would become a legend whispered in the locker rooms and back alleys of the city service industry. A tale of how a quiet waitress with a spine of steel toppled a titan with nothing but a well-placed fact. Maeve Sterling was no longer a victim of circumstance. She was the master of her own narrative. In the days following the departure of Eleanor Sinclair, a profound and lasting peace settled over the Ivory Coast, proving that true strength is found not in the volume of one's voice, but in the unyielding weight of the truth. Maeve Sterling did not remain a waitress for long, as her actions that night had been observed by more than just the terrified staff and the retreating dragon. A regular patron of the restaurant, a man named Arthur Vance, who was a director at a high-end private intelligence and security firm, had been dining at Table 12 and had witnessed the entire psychological dismantling. He approached Maeve during her final shift, his eyes reflecting a deep respect for the surgical precision she had displayed under extreme social pressure. "I have spent 30 years hiring the best analysts in the country, and I have never seen anyone handle a hostile witness with the poise you showed that night," he stated, his voice a warm baritone that commanded immediate attention. He handed her a business card that bore the crest of a firm specialized in corporate forensics and private investigations. "We are looking for someone who can find the cracks in the armor of untouchable people, and I believe you have already passed the interview." Maeve looked at the card and then back at the dining room she had helped liberate, feeling the circle of her life finally closing in a way she had never expected. "I was just doing my job, Mr. Vance, as an archivist and as a human being," she replied, her voice steady and full of a new sense of purpose. She accepted the offer, moving from the world of white linen into the world of high-stakes truth-seeking, returning to the investigative work she truly loved. Eleanor Sinclair, or Jolene Whitlock, was never seen in that part of the city again, becoming a ghost in her own gilded cage, and forever haunted by the past she could no longer control through fear or fortune. This story serves as a powerful reminder that bullies, no matter how rich or powerful they appear, are often just scared people hiding behind a fragile mask of their own making. It shows that when we stand firm in the truth, the shadows must eventually recede, leaving behind a world where justice can finally breathe. The legend of the quiet waitress with the spine of steel continued to inspire the service workers of Chicago, a whispered tale of the night the dragon met its match in a woman who knew the power of a single well-placed fact. If this story resonated with you and reminded you that the underdog can indeed prevail through quiet competence, Please hit that like button to show your support. We invite you to share this story with someone who might be facing their own dragon today, and do not forget to comment with your thoughts on Maeve's journey. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about unexpected heroes and the quiet triumph of justice over tyranny.